I used to believe that life-changing moments arrived with noise, with shouting, tears, or some dramatic collapse that made it obvious something had ended. I never imagined it would begin so quietly, so casually, on an ordinary afternoon I would have otherwise forgotten. I was standing in line at a small café, the kind of place where people come to escape their thoughts, not confront them. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air, cups clinked softly behind the counter, and I was half present, scrolling through my phone, looking at pictures of my husband and me from better days. In every photo we looked solid, safe, like two people who had already survived whatever storms life planned to send. I remember thinking how grateful I was for that sense of certainty, how rare it felt in a world that never promised stability. That was when I felt it, not a touch, not a sound. Just the unmistakable awareness that someone was looking at me with intention. Before I could turn around, a voice spoke from behind my shoulder, low enough that only I could hear it. "I don't mean to intrude," the woman said, "but your husband made a huge mistake." The words landed without urgency, without malice, and that somehow made them more disturbing. My body reacted before my mind did. My heart skipped, my stomach tightened, and my fingers clenched around my phone as if it were suddenly the only thing tethering me to reality. I turned to face her, ready to correct her, to laugh it off, to defend the man I loved from a stranger's audacity. But the expression on her face stopped me. There was no satisfaction there, no curiosity, only exhaustion. The kind that settles into a person who has carried something heavy for far too long. Her eyes held mine with a steadiness that made it impossible to dismiss her as unbalanced or cruel. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times, afraid of it, yet unable to walk away. I asked her what she meant, though my voice barely sounded like my own. She hesitated, glancing around as if checking whether the walls themselves might be listening. Then she said something that cracked something open inside me. She said my husband wasn't who I believed him to be, that the life I was living had been carefully constructed. Not built, but assembled. She told me the truth wasn't coming to destroy me, but it would demand something from me once I heard it. Courage, maybe. Or honesty. Or the willingness to let go of comfort. Before I could gather my thoughts or demand answers, the barista called my name. The moment shattered like glass. I looked away for only a second, and when I turned back, the woman was gone. No farewell. No explanation. Just empty space where certainty used to live. I stood there holding my coffee, my hands shaking slightly, wondering how a stranger could step into my life for less than a minute and leave behind a sentence powerful enough to follow me home. A sentence that refused to stay quiet, no matter how hard I tried to pretend I had never heard it. That evening, our home looked exactly the way it always had. The lights glowed softly in the living room. The familiar hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet, and everything sat in its proper place, as if order alone could guarantee peace. My husband came through the door at his usual time, loosening his tie, setting his keys into the ceramic bowl by the entrance. The same bowl we bought years ago on a trip we both claimed was one of our happiest memories. He kissed my forehead, brief and practiced, and asked how my day had been. I answered automatically, giving him the version of my day that required no follow-up questions, and he nodded at all the right moments. To anyone watching us, we would have looked like a couple who had mastered the rhythm of marriage. But something in me had shifted, and suddenly the rhythm felt rehearsed. As we ate dinner, I studied him the way you study a place you thought you knew but had not visited in years. His voice sounded the same, his laugh appeared at the same predictable pauses, yet everything felt slightly misaligned, as though I were watching a reflection instead of the man himself. I caught myself wondering how many times I had mistaken consistency for honesty. Love, I realized, has a way of dulling your curiosity. It teaches you that asking fewer questions is a form of trust, that comfort is proof of truth. And so I had learned not to notice the pauses before his answers, the way his eyes would shift when I asked about his past, or how entire years of his life were summarized in vague sentences that never invited deeper conversation. That night, lying beside him, I listened to the sound of his breathing. slow, even, untroubled. Sleep came easily to him, as if he had nothing to defend, nothing to explain. I, on the other hand, lay awake, staring into the darkness, replaying the stranger's words over and over until they began to weave themselves into my memories. Moments I had once dismissed as insignificant returned with sharp clarity. The business trips that didn't align with company deadlines, the phone calls he took outside even when the weather was unforgiving, the way his tone changed when I mentioned certain names or places from his past. I remembered how often I had chosen reassurance over reality, how often I had told myself that love meant believing first and questioning later. I thought about all the times my instincts had whispered instead of shouted, and how easily I had ignored them. There were moments when something in his stories didn't quite fit, when timelines blurred, when details shifted just enough to be forgettable. I told myself everyone deserves privacy. I told myself marriage wasn't an interrogation. What I didn't tell myself was that trust should never require the silencing of your own inner voice. Somewhere along the way, I had confused peace with avoidance and loyalty with silence. As he slept, I realized something that frightened me more than any accusation ever could. I didn't actually know where the line was between the man I loved and the man he allowed me to see. I had built my life on the assumption that those two things were the same. And now, with nothing more than a stranger's warning and a house full of quiet, that assumption felt fragile, almost reckless. I turned onto my side, facing him, searching his face in the dim light for answers he wasn't offering. All I found was the unsettling awareness that ignorance had been a choice, and that choice was beginning to unravel. I didn't go looking for her. In fact, for days after that afternoon in the café, I told myself I hoped I would never see her again. There is a strange comfort in unanswered questions. They allow you to return to routine, to pretend nothing has shifted beneath your feet. Yet life has a way of placing truth directly in your path when you are finally ready to stop avoiding it. 3 days later, under a dull, overcast sky, I felt that same sensation again, the quiet awareness of being watched. And before I could dismiss it as imagination, I saw her. She stood across the parking lot, leaning against an old sedan, her arms crossed loosely, her posture calm but deliberate. She didn't wave or call out. She simply waited, as though she understood that this choice had to be mine. For a moment I stayed where I was, my keys clenched in my hand, debating whether to walk away and preserve the fragile version of peace I still had. But something inside me had already crossed that line. I took a step toward her, then another, each one feeling heavier than the last, as if I were walking toward a confession I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. When I reached her, she nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. She told me her name, but the way she said it made me wonder if it was the one she was born with, or simply the one she used now. There was caution in her voice. Not fear, but experience. She said she hadn't planned to speak to me that first day, that she had wrestled with the decision for weeks, carrying the weight of it like a burden that refused to stay buried. Seeing me, she said, had made it impossible to stay silent. She told me she knew my husband long before I ever did, back when he lived under a different name, in a different city, surrounded by people who believed they knew him just as deeply as I thought I did. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if every word had consequences. She said he had a talent for reinvention, for stepping out of one life and into another without leaving visible footprints behind. When I asked her how she recognized him after all these years, her answer chilled me. "Some faces don't change," she said. "They just learn new expressions." As she spoke, the air between us felt heavy, charged with truths that could no longer be contained. She told me about promises he made easily and abandoned just as quickly, about responsibilities he treated like inconveniences once they required sacrifice. She said he didn't explode or destroy. He disappeared. He vanished the moment accountability threatened the image he had built. I felt my chest tighten, not because I wanted to defend him, but because every sentence felt like it was brushing against something I had sensed but never named. I asked her why she was telling me now, why she hadn't spoken sooner, why she had chosen a stranger in a cafe to deliver something this devastating. For the first time, her composure cracked. Her voice wavered as she said that silence had cost her more than speaking ever could. That she had once been where I was, believing in a man who curated truth instead of living it. She told me she wasn't trying to take anything from me. She just didn't want me to lose years of my life to a story that wasn't real. When I asked her what she wanted from me, she shook her head. "Nothing," she said. "I just wanted you to have the choice I didn't." And in that moment, I understood that this conversation wasn't about my husband at all. It was about agency, about the right to know the truth before it quietly reshapes your future without your consent. As we parted, she looked at me with something close to relief, as if handing me the truth had finally allowed her to set something down. I watched her drive away, knowing with unsettling certainty that my life had already begun to divide itself into before and after. After she left, I sat in my car for a long time without turning the engine on. The world outside the windshield continued as if nothing had happened. People walking past with grocery bags, car doors opening and closing, life moving forward without hesitation. But inside me, something had come to a complete stop. Her words echoed in my mind, not loudly but persistently, like a drip of water that refuses to be ignored. I tried to match the man she described with the man I had built my life around, and the distance between those two versions frightened me more than the story itself. She had spoken about him with a strange balance of clarity and restraint, never exaggerating, never dramatizing, as though she understood that truth didn't need embellishment to be devastating. She described the way he could read a room instantly, how he adjusted himself to become whatever people needed him to be. Charming when charm was useful, thoughtful when empathy earned trust, distant when distance protected him. Listening to her, I realized how often I had mistaken adaptability for depth, how easily charisma can disguise calculation. The man she knew wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He didn't shout or strike or threaten. Instead, he withdrew. He erased himself the moment responsibility required more than words. She told me that he had a habit of rewriting his own history, smoothing over the parts that asked too much of him. He spoke of the past as if it were flexible, something that could be edited depending on the listener. I thought of all the times I had asked about his early years, his family, his former relationships, and how his answers had always been neat, almost too tidy, like summaries instead of memories. I remembered how I had accepted that tidiness as emotional maturity, never realizing it might be avoidance disguised as control. When I asked her the question I was most afraid to hear the answer to, whether he had ever been violent or dangerous, she shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "He's not that kind of man." Relief washed over me for just a moment before she continued. "He's the kind who leaves before the damage becomes visible." Those words settled deep in my chest. I understood then that harm doesn't always arrive as something loud and undeniable. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through abandonment, through half-truths, through lives left unfinished while he steps cleanly into another. I asked her if she thought he had changed. This time, she didn't answer immediately. She looked away, watching cars pass as if the truth might be written somewhere in their movement. Finally, she said something I wasn't prepared for. "I think he believes he has," she said. "But believing you're different and being different are not the same thing." Then she looked at me again and said the sentence that would follow me long after our conversation ended. "He loves the life you give him. I don't know if he knows how to love you." That distinction broke something open inside me. I had always measured love by stability, by presence, by the absence of chaos. But her words forced me to ask a more dangerous question. Whether love without accountability is love at all, or simply comfort dressed in a commitment. As I finally started my car and pulled away, I realized I was no longer trying to understand who my husband was before me. I was trying to understand who he had been allowed to remain, and whether I had unknowingly protected that version by never asking him to fully show himself. I didn't confront him right away. After everything she told me, I realized that words alone could still be denied, reshaped, or softened into something easier to live with. What I needed wasn't reassurance. I needed clarity. So I waited. I watched. And when the house was quiet and I was alone with my thoughts, I began to look more closely at the life we had built together, not as a wife searching for comfort, but as someone finally willing to see what had been hidden in plain sight. I started with the small things. The filing cabinet we rarely opened. The old laptop he kept stored away, just in case. Drawers filled with documents I had never felt the need to examine because trust had always felt simpler than curiosity. Each discovery came slowly, almost respectfully, as if the truth itself understood how fragile I was becoming. I found names that didn't match the stories I knew, addresses tied to cities he claimed were only temporary stops, and dates that overlapped in ways that made my stomach tighten. Nothing screamed betrayal at first. Instead, it whispered inconsistency. Late one night, I searched his name online. The man I married appeared exactly as expected. Limited results, professional, unremarkable. Then I typed the name she had given me. My hands shook as I pressed enter, half hoping nothing would appear, half dreading what might. What came back felt like a door swinging open into a room he had locked years ago. Court records, old registrations, a marriage certificate from another state, dated years before we ever met. I stared at the screen, rereading the details, trying to convince myself I was misinterpreting something obvious. But the facts didn't bend the way his stories always had. As I dug deeper, patterns began to form. Addresses that changed just before legal obligations intensified. Jobs that ended abruptly with no clear explanation. A woman whose name appeared repeatedly beside his, then vanished entirely from public records. I searched her name separately, hoping for closure, but found only fragments. It was as if she had stepped out of the story altogether, erased by time or necessity. That absence spoke louder than any accusation. People don't disappear without reason. What surprised me most wasn't the evidence itself. It was how familiar it felt once it surfaced. The discomfort I had ignored, the questions I had swallowed, the quiet instincts that had tried to warn me before a stranger ever did. I realized then that the truth hadn't been hidden so much as it had been waiting for me to stop choosing peace over honesty, waiting for me to be ready to carry it. As the night stretched on, I sat surrounded by documents and open tabs, feeling a strange mix of grief and resolve. Grief for the life I thought was simple and secure. Resolve because, for the first time, I wasn't asking him to explain himself. I wasn't looking for a version of the truth that would let me stay comfortable. I was allowing reality to exist without my permission. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. The stranger hadn't come to destroy my marriage. She had come to return something I had slowly given away. My right to know. I chose my moment carefully, not because I was afraid of him, but because I wanted the truth to have nowhere to hide. I waited for an evening when the house was quiet, when distractions were few and excuses would feel thin. Dinner sat untouched between us, the steam rising and fading as time passed. He noticed my silence. Of course, he always noticed shifts in atmosphere. But he didn't rush to fill it. That alone told me something. He had learned long ago that silence can be more revealing than speech. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me with its steadiness. I didn't accuse, I didn't dramatize. I simply asked him who he was before he met me. Not the polished version he usually offered, not the summarized history he kept ready for moments like this, but the whole truth. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Not anger, not fear, recognition, as if he had always known this moment would arrive, no matter how carefully he had delayed it. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, the way someone does when they realize pretending is no longer necessary. He didn't ask how I knew. He didn't deny what I had discovered. Instead, he nodded, almost imperceptibly, and said, "I was wondering when this would happen." That sentence landed harder than any confession could have. It told me everything I needed to know about how long he had lived with this secret, and how confidently he believed it would remain contained. He told his story calmly, methodically, as if recounting events that belonged to someone else. Different name, different city. A marriage that ended badly. Responsibilities he said he wasn't ready for. Choices he framed as survival rather than escape. He spoke about reinvention as if it were courage, about leaving as if it were growth. And as he talked, I realized he wasn't trying to convince me he hadn't done these things. He was trying to convince me they no longer mattered. When I asked him about the woman whose name disappeared from records, his pause was longer this time. He said she wanted more than he could give. He said timing was wrong. He said people get hurt even when no one intends harm. His words were smooth, practiced, and empty in the places that mattered most. There was no space in his story for accountability, only explanation. No ownership, only distance. Then he looked at me and said I was different. That I was his second chance. That loving me had changed him. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw sincerity. But sincerity without responsibility is still a performance. I asked him a question he couldn't soften. Why he never told me the truth himself. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his honesty was unintentional. He said he didn't want to risk losing what we had. Not me. What we had. The life. The stability. The version of himself that worked. That was when something in me finally settled. I understood that he wasn't afraid of hurting me. He was afraid of losing control over the narrative he had built. I wasn't a partner in his story. I was the setting that made it believable. And as I looked at the man across from me, I felt an unexpected calm. No rage, no collapse, just clarity. I thanked him for telling me the truth, even though he hadn't chosen to tell it freely. And I knew with a certainty that didn't require time or debate that this conversation wasn't the beginning of repair. It was the end of pretending. Leaving him wasn't sudden. It wasn't the kind of dramatic exit you see in movies with doors slammed and voices raised. There was no yelling, no tears spilling in public, no vindictive words to punctuate the end. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The kind of leaving that comes from understanding that some chapters can't be rewritten. I moved through our home slowly, touching things I had lived with for years, things that had once felt like extensions of him, now feeling foreign in my hands. I folded his shirts one by one, aware of the invisible weight each carried, aware that I was reclaiming space not just in the room, but in my mind. I didn't shout, I didn't plead. I packed methodically, organizing my belongings as if the act of folding, placing, and sealing could somehow reshape my heart. Each item became a marker of agency, proof that I was no longer tethered to a story written by someone else. I thought of the stranger who had warned me, whose words had haunted the back of my mind and eventually led me to this moment. She had given me the courage to choose, to look, and to act. I realized then that her warning wasn't about exposing him. It was about reminding me that some truths can't be ignored and some lives can't be lived in shadows. He watched me as I packed. I could feel his gaze, steady and curious, but it wasn't full of fear or regret. It was calm, almost clinical, like someone observing an experiment unfolding. For the first time, I saw him as he really was, the man I had loved in fragments, who had lived in parts that never fully belonged to me. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. His silence told me everything. He understood, without words, that I wasn't leaving because I hated him. I wasn't leaving because I wanted revenge. I was leaving because I had finally stopped pretending that ignorance was safety, that comfort could stand in for truth. I remember the final glance before I walked out the door. It wasn't filled with anger or sadness. It was acknowledgement of a life that had been real in its own way, and of a future I was now determined to claim for myself. I realized that walking away was not loss. It was liberation. My life was no longer confined to a narrative he had written for me. I carried with me the certainty that some mistakes are not corrected by confession, apology, or reconciliation, but by the courage to step away, to refuse to live in the shadow of someone else's choices. The city outside seemed sharper that night. more alive, as if my leaving had breathed life into colors and sounds I had been too distracted to notice. I breathed in deeply, savoring the space that was entirely mine. I had learned something vital. Truth has weight, and freedom has a cost. But both are worth carrying. The stranger had been right. My husband had made a huge mistake. Not just by revealing his past so late or by deceiving me, but by underestimating the strength of a woman willing to confront reality, willing to reclaim her life without waiting for permission. And so I walked away, not as a victim of circumstance, not as someone broken by deceit, but as someone reborn through clarity. Each step I took felt deliberate, measured, and final. I carried with me the knowledge that love is never complete without honesty, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in confronting others but in confronting yourself, and choosing a path that honors your own truth above all else. Months have passed since that day, though the memories feel as vivid as if they happened yesterday. I still think about the stranger who appeared in my life like a quiet force of reckoning, delivering a truth I didn't want, but desperately needed. She never asked for thanks, never sought acknowledgement. She didn't want closure. She simply offered me the one gift I had unknowingly surrendered, the right to see clearly, to act decisively, and to reclaim my own story. I think of her often, a ghost of wisdom, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected voices. As for my husband, the man I once thought I knew, I understand him now more fully than I ever did when I was married to him. He was many things, charming, clever, meticulous, and deeply skilled at hiding. But he was also fractured, self-serving in ways that didn't always announce themselves, and unwilling to face the full weight of his past. He wasn't cruel in the way people fear. He was the kind of man who could leave without a trace, who could rebuild himself, not because he had changed, but because he had learned how to survive with less accountability. He made mistakes, countless ones, and none of them can be excused by circumstance or intention. Yet even as I name these things, I don't carry hatred. I only carry clarity. And then there is me. Who I became through this process is a truth I hold closer than any relationship, any love, any comfort I thought I had earned. I became someone who listens, not just to the words spoken, but to the instincts that whisper before words are even formed. I became someone who understands that love without honesty is a beautiful illusion, a fragile construct that can collapse without warning. I became someone who no longer confuses comfort with safety, who no longer sacrifices self-respect for the sake of appearances. I became someone willing to walk away, even when leaving is terrifying, because the alternative, living in the shadow of deception, is far worse. Sometimes I revisit the places where he and I used to go, the coffee shops, the parks, the quiet streets where we walked and planned our future. They feel different now. Not smaller, not sadder, just clearer. I see them as stages in a story that was real in its own way, but incomplete. And I see myself walking forward through those memories, carrying not regret but knowledge. Knowledge that shapes every decision I make, every relationship I enter, every path I choose. That knowledge is both armor and wings. The truth is, some people enter your life to teach you lessons you could never learn otherwise. Some people appear once, speak their truth, and vanish, leaving you with only the echoes. And some people, strangers, friends, or even lovers, reveal a version of reality that shakes you, not to punish you, but to awaken you. I am awake now. I am no longer defined by the mistakes of others, by the charm of someone who could not fully love me, by the illusions I once held sacred. I am defined by the strength it took to see clearly, to accept what was, and to step into a future that belongs entirely to me. And that is the final truth. My husband made a huge mistake, but the bigger truth, the one that carries me forward every day, is that I found myself because of it. I became someone who sees, someone who chooses, someone who walks in the light of her own understanding. And in that there is freedom, there is peace, and there is a quiet, unshakable power that no one can take away. Time has a strange way of moving after everything you thought you knew collapses. At first, it feels like every hour stretches endlessly, each second demanding attention, forcing reflection. The mornings are quiet, but not peaceful. They hum with the memory of what was, of what could have been. I wake and sometimes catch myself reaching for someone who is no longer there, only to remember that what he offered was never truly mine to hold. The absence isn't empty. It's instructive. It teaches patience. It teaches resilience. It teaches that life continues, even when the foundation you believed was unshakable has shifted beneath you. I've learned to embrace this new rhythm, small routines. A walk in the early morning light, a cup of tea by the window, a journal filled with observations no one else will read. They are my anchors. They are reminders that stability can be rebuilt, not on someone else's story, but on the one I choose to write myself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight of betrayal eases, replaced by clarity, and more importantly, by self-trust. I no longer wait for someone to reveal truth to me. I look for it myself. I honor my instincts, question what feels wrong, and celebrate what feels genuine. The stranger's warning was only the beginning. The real journey was learning to listen to myself. Relationships now feel different. Love is no longer a refuge built on illusion. It is a careful, deliberate act of trust earned through honesty, shared struggles, and mutual respect. I approach people differently. Not with fear, but with discernment. I don't demand perfection, but I do demand transparency. I've learned that freedom and intimacy are not mutually exclusive. They coexist when boundaries are respected and truth is never optional. And while the memory of him lingers, it no longer has the power to define me or limit my happiness. Sometimes, I think about the stranger again. I wonder if she knows the difference she made, if she understands how her courage rippled through my life, changing the course of my choices. I hope she does. I hope she knows that a single sentence, spoken with honesty, can dismantle illusions and build strength in their place. And I've come to understand that we all carry such potential. To speak truth, to witness truth, and to act on it, even when it is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unwelcome. Life after truth is quieter in some ways, but infinitely richer. I've become someone who can endure uncertainty without surrendering her own integrity, someone who can see deception and still respond with clarity, someone who can grieve what was lost while celebrating what remains. And in that quiet richness, I've discovered the most powerful lesson of all. The greatest mistakes of others cannot chain you unless you allow them to. Your life, your choices, and your capacity to love yourself. These are yours, untouched by anyone else's past. As I walk forward now, each day feels like an invitation to live fully, to see clearly, and to remain unafraid of the truths yet to come. The man I once married, the man who made so many mistakes, is behind me. But who I am, who I continue to become, stretches endlessly ahead, and that, in the end, is more than enough.